Section 1. The Haunting of Kettle Creek. The wind howled through the narrow streets of Kettle Creek, a dying town nestled in the arid plains of the Wild West. Dust swirled in violent gusts, scraping against the weathered wooden walls of saloons and general stores, as if the town itself were trying to escape the inevitable. It had been months since the last major rainfall, and the ground was cracked, brittle, a reflection of the people who still called this place home. The town was nothing more than a shadow of its former self, its once thriving mining operations now reduced to rusting equipment and empty hopes. Yet for all the desolation, there was one thing the people of Kettle Creek feared more than the empty streets and endless dust: the Wraith. Sheriff Marcus McGrath stood in front of the saloon, his face shaded by the brim of his dusty hat, staring out at the horizon. The sun had dipped low, casting long, stretched shadows across the land. The Wraith, a disfigured man on horseback, had been terrorizing the area for weeks. Travelers who had dared to venture through Kettle Creek were found burned, their bodies charred beyond recognition, their faces frozen in terror. They whispered that the Wraith was a force of vengeance, some twisted harbinger of justice, punishing those who deserved it and leaving no trace of mercy behind. But Sheriff McGrath wasn't so sure. He'd been a lawman too long to buy into ghost stories and rumors. Still, the reports were undeniable. His deputy, a young man named Sam Porter, had found another body just outside town. A woman in her 30s, burned beyond recognition, her eyes wide with fear, her body draped over a pile of smoldering kindling. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of who the killer might be. It was as though she had been struck down by some invisible hand, condemned to a fiery death that she never saw coming. McGrath's jaw tightened as he glanced at the stars beginning to twinkle in the evening sky. He had seen enough to know that this wasn't just some random act of violence. This was personal. The Wraith wasn't some mindless killer. He was out for something more than death. "You think it's him?" Sam's voice broke through the stillness, pulling the sheriff from his thoughts. McGrath turned to face his deputy. Sam's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, but there was a flicker of determination behind them. It was a look McGrath had seen in the eyes of men who had stood at the edge of the abyss and had yet to find their way back. "It's him," McGrath said, his voice low and steady. He didn't need to explain further. Sam had seen the same thing: the burned bodies, the ashes scattered like breadcrumbs leading nowhere. They were chasing a phantom, a man who left no trail, no motive, and no answers. "We can't keep waiting," Sam said, his voice tinged with urgency. "We've got to stop him before someone else." Before he could finish, a sharp cry echoed from the direction of the town square, followed by the unmistakable sound of hooves pounding the earth. McGrath's heart skipped a beat. He had heard that sound before. The Wraith was near. The sheriff wasted no time. He spun on his heel and grabbed his rifle from the rack inside the saloon, his fingers cold and steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Sam was right behind him, his hand hovering over his revolver, ready for whatever came next. The two men ran toward the source of the commotion, their boots kicking up dust with every step. The town square was empty when they arrived. The only sign that anything had happened was the faint smell of smoke hanging in the air. It clung to their clothes, settling like a heavy fog around them. McGrath's eyes scanned the area, searching for any hint of the Wraith's presence. There was nothing, just the usual emptiness. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. A shadow moved quickly across the street, too fast for a man on foot. McGrath's heart raced as he turned toward it. He didn't have to see the man's face to know who it was. The Wraith. The figure was mounted on a black horse, his body cloaked in dark rags, his disfigured face obscured by a mask of soot and ash. The rider was silent, as if he were nothing more than a Wraith himself, an embodiment of death, stalking the living. "Hold on," McGrath whispered, his voice barely audible, his breath shallow as his instincts kicked in. Before Sam could respond, the Wraith spurred his horse and with a sharp, guttural cry, he charged. The sound of hooves pounding the ground echoed in the sheriff's ears, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. McGrath instinctively raised his rifle, but the rider was already upon them. The wraith's eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed with a pale, eerie light. He was close now, so close that McGrath could smell the acrid stench of smoke that followed him like a shroud. A sudden flare of heat brushed past him as the wraith drew a long, curved blade from his side. It gleamed in the dying light of the evening, its edge razor-sharp. Before the sheriff could react, the wraith swung the blade and a blast of fire erupted from the horseman's hand. The flames leaped into the air, searing the wooden structures nearby. The sheriff ducked instinctively, and Sam fell back in a panic, barely managing to avoid the flames. The wraith was gone almost as quickly as he had come, vanishing into the shadows once more, leaving the town square scorched and smoldering. "Damn it!" McGrath cursed, his voice thick with frustration and something else, something darker, buried deep within him. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand, his eyes burning with unspoken rage. "This isn't just happening to the town," he thought bitterly. "It's happening to me." "We've got to stop him, Sheriff," Sam said, his voice trembling. His gaze flickered nervously toward the smoldering remnants of the buildings. "We can't let him keep doing this." McGrath stood tall, his gaze fixed on the place where the wraith had disappeared. For the first time in a long while, he felt a cold knot form in his gut. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep pretending that this wasn't personal. The wraith's attacks were becoming more frequent, more violent. McGrath felt the weight of his responsibility settling on his shoulders, a weight he knew he couldn't ignore much longer. The wraith was a harbinger, but the real question was, who or what was he avenging? "Let's get back to the station, Sam," McGrath said, his voice low and hardened. "There's a lot we need to figure out." As they turned to leave, McGrath couldn't shake the feeling that the wraith's path was no random journey. It was a hunt, and McGrath had a deep, gnawing sense that he might be the one being hunted. Section 2, Into the Shadows. The night air was thick with silence as McGrath and Sam walked back to the sheriff's office, their boots heavy on the cracked dirt road. The flickering lanterns that lined the streets cast long, wavering shadows, their light barely enough to cut through the darkness. The distant sound of a coyote's cry echoed through the empty streets, but it did little to break the oppressive stillness that hung over Kettle Creek. The town seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. McGrath could feel the weight of Sam's gaze on him, the young deputy's unease palpable. Sam had always looked up to him, ever since he was a boy. McGrath had been the lawman who cleaned up the town, who put down the chaos when things got out of hand. But now Sam saw the cracks. McGrath's once unwavering confidence was beginning to show signs of fraying, just like the town itself. "Sheriff, you think he's doing this because of something he's seen? Something that happened to him?" Sam asked, breaking the silence. McGrath hesitated for a moment, unsure how to answer. His thoughts were tangled in a mess of half-formed theories, each one as dark as the next. He had seen the wraith's face, if only for a moment, and there was something about it that gnawed at him. The grotesque scars, the twisted features. It was as though the man had become something else entirely. Something not quite human. But it wasn't just that. There was something familiar about the man, too. Something that stirred a long-buried memory deep within him. "I don't know, Sam," McGrath said finally, his voice low and strained. "But I think it's personal, and that's what scares me." They reached the sheriff's office in silence. The door creaked open, and the two men stepped inside, the dim light from the oil lamps casting long shadows on the walls. McGrath moved to his desk, the pile of paperwork from the past few days sitting untouched. The constant stream of reports about missing travelers and burned bodies had become nothing more than a blur of names and dates. But there was something new, a letter that had been slipped under the door earlier that evening. McGrath frowned as he picked it up, the envelope unmarked except for a crude, blackened symbol that was scrawled across the front. He had seen it before. The Wraith, Sam murmured, his voice barely a whisper as he stepped closer. McGrath nodded grimly. The symbol was unmistakable, a scorch mark, like a brand. The same mark had been found near each of the bodies that had been discovered over the past few weeks. He ripped open the envelope, his eyes scanning the contents quickly. The letter was brief, the handwriting uneven, as though the writer had been trembling when it was penned. But the words were clear. You're the reason he rides. The sins of the past come back to haunt you. The Wraith will find you when the time is right. McGrath's hand tightened around the paper, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been expecting something like this, but the letter still hit him like a cold punch to the gut. The sins of the past. The Wraith was tied to something McGrath had done long ago, a choice he had made, one that he had buried deep in the recesses of his mind. A choice that now seemed to be catching up with him, dragging the town along with it. Sheriff, Sam began, his voice tinged with concern. What does it mean? The sins of the past? McGrath stared at the letter, his mind racing. The words seemed to burn into him. He thought back to the time before he was sheriff, before he had become the man he was today. He had been young, filled with ambition, and had made decisions in the heat of the moment. Decisions that, at the time, had seemed necessary. But now they felt like a weight he could never shake off. I don't know, Sam, he said, his voice hoarse, but I think it's time I find out. The sheriff stood abruptly, pushing the chair back with a harsh scrape against the wooden floor. He grabbed his rifle, checking it for the 100th time, his hands steady despite the growing tension in his chest. There was no turning back now. The Wraith wasn't just an enemy he had to track down. It was a reckoning, one that was tied to the very core of his being. We're going after him, McGrath said, his voice firm, but there was a dark edge to it. We need to find out who he is and what he wants. No more waiting. Sam didn't argue, but the hesitation was clear in his eyes. The fear was there too. He had seen the destruction the Wraith left in his wake, but he wasn't yet ready to confront whatever ghost was haunting the sheriff. The two men mounted their horses and rode out of the sheriff's office, their faces set against the chill of the night air. The stars above gleamed like distant, watchful eyes, indifferent to the path the men were about to take. The wind whispered warnings in their ears, carrying with it the scent of smoke and the bitter taste of something wrong. As they rode out of town, McGrath couldn't shake the feeling that he was being led somewhere. The Wraith had left a trail, an invisible path of destruction, scattered with bodies and half-burned belongings. But McGrath knew it wasn't the bodies the Wraith was after. The man on horseback was hunting something else. Vengeance. And it was a vengeance that McGrath himself had invited into this world long ago. The road ahead was empty, stretching out under the vast sky, but McGrath knew that wasn't the case. He could feel it, the shadow of the past closing in on him. It wouldn't be long before the Wraith caught up to them. Section 3. The Wraith's Trail. The moon was high, casting an eerie glow over the desolate plains as McGrath and Sam rode deeper into the wilderness. The wind had died down, leaving a haunting stillness in its place. The only sound was the steady clip-clop of their horses' hooves against the hard earth, a rhythmic echo that seemed to mock the growing tension between them. The sheriff's thoughts were a tangled mess, his mind replaying the letter, the dark words that had sealed his fate, the sins of the past. He couldn't shake them, no matter how hard he tried. They followed him now, dogging his every step, and he was afraid that there was no escaping them. Sam kept glancing at him, as if waiting for some sign that the sheriff had a plan, some inkling of how to track the Wraith. But McGrath had no answers. The Wraith was a ghost, a force that left no trace but destruction. The sheriff had seen enough to know that he couldn't just shoot this problem down like a wild animal. The man on horseback was something else entirely, something darker. You sure about this, Sheriff? Sam's voice broke through McGrath's brooding thoughts. I mean, we're heading out into the wild. What if he's not out here at all? What if we're just chasing shadows? McGrath didn't answer right away. He knew Sam's fear was valid, There were no tracks, no signs of the Wraith's presence in the direction they were headed. Yet something told him the man was out here, waiting. The letter had spoken of reckoning, of vengeance. It wasn't just the townsfolk he was after. It was McGrath himself, and the sheriff had a sinking feeling that the Wraith knew exactly where to find him. "I'm sure," McGrath said, his voice tight with a determination that surprised even him. "If he's coming for me, we'll find him, and I'm going to put an end to it." Sam fell silent, but McGrath could feel the young deputy's doubts lingering in the air like a thick fog. They pushed on through the darkness, the ground growing rougher beneath their horses' hooves. Hours passed in silence, the night stretching long and endless. The chill in the air seemed to creep under McGrath's skin, settling into his bones. But just as he was starting to think they might have missed the Wraith altogether, a sharp cry pierced the stillness, louder than the coyotes, more desperate. It came from ahead, from the heart of the canyon they were riding toward. McGrath signaled for Sam to stop. The two men listened intently, their breath fogging in the cold air. The sound was unmistakable. Someone or something was in distress. "Could be him," Sam whispered, his hand on his revolver. "Or it could be someone else." McGrath nodded, a grim set to his jaw. "Either way, we need to check it out. Stay close." They urged their horses forward, riding swiftly but cautiously toward the source of the noise. As they crested a ridge, the sight that met them made McGrath's heart sink. A small campfire burned brightly in the center of a narrow ravine. Several horses were tethered nearby, their saddlebags hastily packed. But it wasn't the horses that caught McGrath's attention. It was the figure standing by the fire, his back turned toward them. The Wraith. The disfigured man stood tall, his cloak billowing in the wind. His face was half hidden by a mask of soot and burn marks, but his eyes, they gleamed with an unnatural light, as though they were reflecting something deeper, something that twisted McGrath's stomach in knots. He was speaking softly, too softly for McGrath to make out the words, but it was clear he wasn't alone. McGrath motioned for Sam to dismount. They moved forward, crouching low, the wind muffling their movements. As they got closer, the figures around the fire came into view. There were three of them, men hunched over, their heads bent low as if in reverence. They were shackled at the wrists, their clothes torn, their faces gaunt with hunger and fear. It was then that McGrath realized this wasn't just about vengeance. This was about something darker, something tied to the land itself. The Wraith spoke again, louder this time, and McGrath's blood ran cold. "Your suffering is but a shadow of what's to come," the Wraith intoned, his voice eerie and detached. "The ones who burned are not the innocent. It is the ones who let them burn, the ones who stood by and did nothing, who will be judged." McGrath felt his stomach churn. The words struck him like a physical blow, and for the first time he realized the depth of the Wraith's rage. It wasn't a random act of violence. The Wraith wasn't simply killing for the sake of it. He was punishing. He was purging. And McGrath knew, deep down, that he was implicated in this twisted version of justice. The sheriff felt a sharp pang of recognition, the words of the Wraith echoing in his mind. The ones who let them burn. He had let it happen. McGrath's mind flashed back to a memory he had long buried. A memory of a fire, of a burning house, of innocent people trapped inside. He had been part of the decision to turn away, to let the flames consume the house while they rode off, hoping the law would do something, anything. But nothing had been done. The family inside had perished, their screams swallowed by the night. The sheriff's guilt had been buried under layers of denial, but now it rose up like a beast, gnawing at him, demanding to be acknowledged. "Sheriff, you're pale," Sam said, softly, his voice edged with concern. McGrath didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind was a whirlpool of shame, of choices that had led him down this dark path. The Wraith wasn't just punishing others. He was punishing McGrath. Suddenly the Wraith turned. His gaze locked onto the sheriff and Sam, his eyes cold and piercing. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The Wraith knew they were there. McGrath's heart skipped a beat. and he reached for his revolver. But before he could draw, the Wraith spoke again. "It's too late for redemption, Sheriff," the Wraith said, his voice a low, mocking hiss. "The sins of the past can never be undone." With that, the Wraith mounted his horse, spurring the beast into motion, and the two shackled men scrambled to their feet, seemingly under some unspoken command. They ran into the night, their faces hollow with fear and resignation. The Wraith was gone as quickly as he had appeared, vanishing into the darkness. McGrath was left standing there, his thoughts crashing against one another, the truth settling over him like a cold shroud. The Wraith wasn't just a monster, he was a judgment, and the sheriff had been the one who had called it into being. Section 4. The Reckoning. The following days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and frantic searching. Sheriff McGrath could no longer deny it. His past had caught up with him in the form of the Wraith. The figure on horseback had become more than just an enemy to defeat. He was the embodiment of everything McGrath had buried deep within his soul. Every corner of Kettle Creek now felt tainted by the sins McGrath had allowed to fester, and with each passing day, the sense of inevitability grew stronger. There was no escaping the past, no hiding from the guilt that had slowly consumed him. McGrath sat alone in the sheriff's office late one night, the flickering lantern casting long shadows across the room. Sam had gone to bed hours ago, his face drawn with worry. The deputy had known the sheriff for years, but even he was beginning to question whether McGrath was fit to lead the town. The sheriff's hands shook as he stared at the clutter of papers on his desk, case files, burned letters, and photographs of the victims. Nothing about this made sense anymore. But then, there it was, another letter. The envelope was marked with the same symbol, a scorch mark, like a brand. McGrath's heart sank as he tore it open. This one, unlike the previous letters, was longer, its contents more direct. "You did not save them. You never tried. Now you will see what you have done. The Wraith is not a man. He is your reflection. His fire is the same fire that burned in your soul when you made the choice. It is your wrath that has given him life. You cannot run from the flames. They will find you." The words were a gut punch. McGrath felt the world tilt, his vision blurring with the weight of the truth. The Wraith was not a separate entity. He wasn't some force of nature. He was the result of a decision McGrath had made long ago. The burning house, the screams of the family inside, the coldness in his heart as he turned away. The Wraith was the manifestation of his own darkness, an avenging spirit born from his own refusal to act when it mattered. The sheriff stood up, his chest tight with the realization. The sins he had committed were not just his own, they were the town's. Kettle Creek had chosen to look the other way, to ignore the injustices that had festered in the shadows. Now the consequences were upon them all. Sam's voice called out from the doorway, interrupting McGrath's spiraling thoughts. "Sheriff, you need to come out here. There's something you need to see." McGrath quickly folded the letter and shoved it into his coat pocket. He followed Sam out into the cold night air, the chill biting at his skin. They walked in silence toward the edge of town, where a small group of townsfolk had gathered. The tension in the air was palpable, the whispers of fear swirling around them like the dust in the wind. McGrath's heart clenched as he saw the group standing in front of a large, smoldering pile of charred remains. Another attack! The town had finally become the Wraith's stage. A family, men, women, and children, had been caught in the wake of his vengeance. Their belongings were scattered around the site, their bodies burned beyond recognition. But it wasn't just the fire that had killed them. The marks on their skin, the seared flesh where the Wraith had struck, were unmistakable. It was as though they had been branded by something far worse than flame. McGrath could barely breathe. His stomach churned as he scanned the remains. The fire hadn't just consumed them. It had almost seemed personal, like a statement. Each body had been mutilated in some way. One woman's hand was outstretched, her fingers frozen in a desperate plea. A child's face was twisted in terror, the eyes wide with the memory of something awful. It wasn't just death that had come for them. It was something far worse. A figure stepped forward from the crowd. It was an older man, his face weary and lined with years of hardship. His hands trembled as he pointed to the smoldering remains. "Sheriff, this was your fault," the man said, his voice low but full of accusation. "You let them burn. You turned away when they needed you." McGrath's breath caught in his throat. The town was looking to him, waiting for him to do something, but there was nothing left to do. The Wraith had already claimed his victims, and McGrath had no answer. He had failed them all. There was no justice he could bring. There was only the echo of his choices, reverberating in the fire that had consumed these innocent lives. "Sheriff," Sam said again, his voice softer now. "What do we do?" McGrath swallowed hard, his mind numb. The Wraith was here, in the heart of the town. He was waiting, and he wasn't going to stop until McGrath paid the price. "I need to face him," McGrath said, his voice tight with resolve. "I need to stop this, for good." Sam hesitated, his face filled with concern, but there was something else in the sheriff's eyes. Something that told Sam this wasn't just about the Wraith anymore. This was McGrath's reckoning. "We'll go together," Sam said, his voice steady. McGrath nodded, his heart heavy with the knowledge that there would be no coming back from this. The Wraith wasn't just a figure to defeat. He was a judgment, a reckoning that McGrath had invited into his life. And now it was time to pay the price. The two men walked back to their horses, the weight of the past pressing down on them like an immovable boulder. They rode in silence, the town fading behind them as they ventured into the wilderness, the horizon stretching ahead. The fire of the Wraith's vengeance burned brighter with each passing step. And McGrath knew that the final confrontation was close. He could feel it in his bones. When they reached the place where they had first encountered the Wraith, where the fire had started, McGrath could sense the man's presence. The air felt heavier here, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. And then, from the shadows, the Wraith appeared. Section 5, the final confrontation. The forest was deathly quiet as Sheriff McGrath and Deputy Sam Porter rode into the heart of the canyon. The Wraith's presence loomed like a shadow over the land, palpable in the thick, cold air that wrapped itself around them like a shroud. The trees stood in eerie silence, their skeletal branches reaching out like twisted arms, their leaves long since lost to the seasons. This was the place where the fire had started, the place where McGrath's past sins had set everything in motion. And now it seemed it would be the place where it would all end. They dismounted without a word, the weight of their saddlebags dragging heavily on their shoulders. Sam stood a few steps behind McGrath, his face filled with a mix of fear and resolve. He had seen the sheriff's face before, the same look of quiet determination that had always kept the town safe. But now it was tinged with something darker. Guilt, fear, regret, and perhaps something else. Something McGrath had only just begun to understand. The Wraith had to be here. His presence felt suffocating, like a storm waiting to break. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long, thin shadows across the jagged rocks. There was no sign of the figure yet, but McGrath could feel him in every creak of the night, in every whisper of the wind. "Sheriff," Sam said, his voice barely audible, "we don't have to do this. We can go back. You've done all you can." McGrath shook his head, the words settling deep within him. Sam didn't understand. How could he? Sam hadn't been there. Sam hadn't made the choice. He hadn't turned away when people had begged for help. "No," McGrath said, his voice steady but cold. "This is something I have to finish. For them. And for me." The silence pressed in again. Sam didn't argue further. He just stood there waiting for whatever was coming next. The ground beneath their feet shifted. A low sound, barely more than a whisper, rose from the darkness ahead. McGrath stiffened, his hand tightening around the handle of his revolver. Then from the shadows, the Wraith emerged. He was a figure of death, cloaked in tattered rags, his face half covered in scars and burns, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The fire that had disfigured him had not dulled his fury. It had only sharpened it, like a blade. His presence was both terrifying and magnetic, like a force of nature that could not be denied. "You came," the wraith said, his voice hollow, like the wind itself. "Did you think you could escape your sins? That you could outrun your past?" McGrath stood tall, meeting the wraith's gaze. He didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. The truth was here, staring him in the face. "I never thought I could escape," McGrath said, his voice low and steady. "I just thought I could hide." The wraith chuckled, a sound like the crackling of burning wood. "Hiding does not absolve you, Sheriff. The fire does not forget, and neither will I." McGrath's hands shook as he reached for his gun, the weight of his guilt heavier than ever. The fire had been his decision. He had made the choice, and now the consequences had come for him. But the truth was more complicated than that. The wraith wasn't just vengeance incarnate. He was McGrath's reckoning. He was the sheriff's own guilt, embodied in the flames that had consumed so many. The wraith's horse snorted, pawing at the ground impatiently, as if it too recognized the finality of this moment. McGrath knew there was no turning back. He had come here to face the past, to make amends for a decision that had haunted him for years. But he also knew there was no redemption to be found in this confrontation. Only an end. Suddenly, the wraith spurred his horse forward with a swift motion, and it bolted toward McGrath at a terrifying speed. The sheriff's instincts kicked in, and he drew his revolver in a fluid motion. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the canyon like thunder, the bullet finding its mark in the wraith's side. But it wasn't enough. The wraith didn't even flinch. He kept coming, his eyes burning with fury. His figure seemed to shimmer in the moonlight, as if his very presence was fading in and out of reality. McGrath's heart pounded in his chest. His second shot missed, and the wraith was upon him. In one swift motion, the wraith leapt off his horse and tackled McGrath to the ground. The two men struggled, the earth beneath them shifting as they rolled across the rocky terrain. "You didn't save them," the wraith hissed, his breath foul with the smell of smoke and decay. "You let them die, Sheriff." McGrath could feel the heat of the wraith's breath, could feel the strength of the man's rage pouring through him. The sheriff fought to push him off, but the wraith was like an immovable force, his grip tightening around McGrath's throat. For a moment, everything went dark as the weight of the wraith's body crushed the air from his lungs. But then, something inside McGrath snapped. A flood of memories, the screams of the burning family, the sound of the flames licking at the night sky, rushed through him. His guilt, his fear, his shame, all of it exploded into a primal rage. He drove his elbow into the wraith's side with everything he had left. The wraith let out a strangled cry and stumbled backward, giving McGrath the space he needed. With one final surge of strength, the sheriff reached for his revolver, aiming it straight at the wraith's heart. The gunshot rang out, loud and final. The wraith collapsed to the ground, his body twitching for a moment before falling still. His eyes, those glowing eyes, faded into darkness, and the forest seemed to exhale, the weight lifting from the air. For a long moment, McGrath didn't move. His chest heaved with exertion, his breath ragged. He had done it. He had stopped the wraith. But as he stared down at the figure before him, the truth of the encounter settled in. The wraith had been him. He had been the one who had allowed the fire to burn. He had been the one who had stood by, doing nothing. The wraith's vengeance hadn't been a supernatural force. It had been a reflection of McGrath's own soul. The flames he had let consume others had come for him in the end. "Sheriff," Sam said, his voice trembling as he stepped forward, his face pale. "Is it over?" McGrath didn't answer at first. He just looked at the figure before him, the man who had been both his punishment and his salvation. The wraith was gone, but the consequences of McGrath's actions would stay with him forever. "Yeah," McGrath finally said, his voice hollow. "It's over." But even as he spoke the words, he knew that the scars of his past would never fully heal. The wraith may have been defeated, but the fire would continue to burn within him, and that was something he would carry for the rest of his life.